To know Aatish Taseer's life is to really become aware that very few people get to not just, as I said earlier, be part of a cultural conversation, but to be it. Aatish is not just the embodiment of a cultural conversation, of cultural wars. He really has lived out slices of history, of geography, of conflict. Everything that we read about, his life has actually embodied. And more you read Aatish really excavating his own life, trying to understand it, you become aware that very few people really get to be a piece of fiction. His life really is like a piece of fiction speaking out loud. And it's a particular privilege to have him here today because, as I said, every incendiary conversation of the subcontinent is embodied in his life. To give you the bald facts, because then I don't want him to be unraveling his biography for us, but really the implications of his biography. Let me quickly share with you his life. As many of you know, he's the son, the love child of Tavleen Singh, the journalist, Indian journalist, a Sikh, with Salman Taseer, the Muslim politician from Pakistan, born out of wedlock. Really rejected finally by Salman Taseer when he chose a political life. He was a businessman. Aatish spent a long time trying to understand who he was, searching for his father, took him through a journey through 8 or 9 Muslim countries, trying to understand what Islam meant to his father, what Pakistan meant to his father, because it became a source of estrangement between the two of them. But then he lost his father to, of course, a violent assassination. And the irony doesn't just end there. His life is full of literary ironies because his maternal grandfather came away during partition, served in the Indian army, and found it very difficult to fight those people whom he considered his own. His paternal grandfather was a friend of Iqbal's, again, ironically, became a conservative who was really on the prosecution end against Manto on the obscenity trials that Manto had to fight in Pakistan. And as life would have it, he loses his son, Salman Taseer, to those same elements that he was in a way supporting, because Salman Taseer died fighting for a Christian woman on whom the blasphemy law had been invoked and she had been sentenced to death. By speaking up for her, Salman lost his own life. The ironies don't just end there, because then Aatish finds out that he's gay and ends up feeling a sexual refugee actually from both parents, goes to New York, feels an outsider even in New York because he's really feeling tugged back home. And so his latest book is now to try and understand India. What about India draws him and repels him away from it, propels him away from it? A search for Sanskrit, because through Sanskrit we have, as he uses a very memorable phrase, we have almost an automatic incuriosity about old India. And yet India is divided into so many selves, and he feels all those selves within himself. And then he has the Englishman sitting on his shoulder, or the Westerner sitting on his shoulder, and he's looking at his country through the prism of all of us who've had an anglicized education, Macaulay's children. So he's really set apart. He has many disjuncts in his life, and in searching for himself, he's really unraveling, when I say the subcontinent, pretty much all of Asian history, Asia's relationship, or Pakistan and India's relationship with religion, Hinduism, Islam, all of it, and then that essential sexual identity of who you really are. So to listen to his story, to understand its implications for all of us, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a very accomplished writer, Aatish Taseer. I forgot to tell you, of course, in between he bivouacked with having a relationship with the British royal.
Let's not confuse everybody, okay?
And the British royalty is also upset with him. So now he's upset the Hindutva brigade.
She's going too far.
The Sanskrit brigade, the Hinduism brigade, India, America, Trump, and of course the British royalty as well. So great to have you here, Aatish. Let's start with your father. I've described all the ruptures, or at least some of the ruptures in your life, Aatish, and you could have been forgiven for being a very confused and a very hurt child. Instead, you have really deployed this very rich biography, as I said, and looked at it through literary ways, philosophical ways, searching for its meaning, searching for yourself. And the original rupture was with your father, your relationship with your father. Would you tell us, what that original rejection was from? What was the source of that? And in your travels through all the Islamic countries, What understanding did you arrive at? What was the blind spot your father had towards Pakistan and Islam, which in a way is shared by others in the community, particularly in Pakistan, which estranged you?
Yeah. Well, on a very personal level, he left a hole in my life, and when one becomes a writer, one almost has a responsibility to find a kind of wholeness, a completion of some sort. And in a very basic way, I think I've written this, that his absence became a presence in my life, and it became something that dominated my life. So that first urge to go in search of him and later to write about him was an urge to not have that be something that overwhelmed my life. I wanted to have my full life, and I thought if I didn't do this thing, then it would overshadow. And thank God I did, because there wasn't much time. It was that window, and I did it. I got to know him, and I found a way to give this surreal absence a kind of reality, and I was very, very happy for that. For your second question, so yeah, exactly, these different layers, because on one hand, we'd had this conflict around the time, in the middle of getting to know him, there'd been the London bombings, there'd been Pakistan and Pakistani Muslims in Britain, as well as Islam generally changing in very profound ways. And my father was in a profound state of denial about those things, and was sort of saying, it's the Americans, it's the Jews, it's a bit of nonsense, we're Sufi Muslims, everything will go away. And of course, he was not right about that. And so the journey was, because I start as a writer, and I enjoy that feeling to start from a place of complete ignorance. So I didn't know about Islam, but I didn't know about what it meant to be a cultural Muslim. I didn't know what it meant for a part of your history to be fused with the history of faith. None of these things I hadn't grown up that way. I'd grown up in a Sikh household in Delhi. And so all of this was a discovery. And of course the book tore us apart, because he was so upset by it. He was upset by it on a personal level. He was upset by what it said about Pakistan. And later one was confronted with the fact that that Pakistan that is depicted in Stranger to History was the Pakistan that killed him. So
in fact, Aatish, you put it really well, so what was that discovery? As you said, you started from a place of actually no judgment, because you didn't know anything about it. And in fact, you went out to find a man you wanted to love. And so what was that construct? For instance, when you say the idea of a cultural Muslim is something that was new to you, would you help the audience understand what that is? And why has it become the weakness of Pakistan to be that? You speak very forthrightly. And I'm saying this again, there's a culture now of India hating Pakistan. It's just become commonplace.
Yeah.
And yet there's a denial on all sides, and we'll come to India's denial as well. You speak of the tragedy of Pakistan that sees itself as something and has really constructed itself for failure. What was that discovery?
Well, when someone says they're a cultural Muslim, he would make it seem, people often, when I live in New York, people say I'm a cultural Jew. It means you get your child circumcised, you go to a Jewish wedding, you have, a little feeling for Jewish writers. And Abba made it seem also that it was, a bit of fairs and mir, and, one did a few things that were sort of almost benign, that were part of like a cultural identity. But actually, as I traveled, I discovered that his political and historical worldview was shaped by religion, by a religious community at least, and that Islam was like a nationality. It was not, you could never, if you were born Muslim, not be Muslim. And whether it was to do with the conflict in Kashmir, the conflict in Palestine, this thing had a far greater hold on him than he was willing to admit. And in seeing myself in relation to him, I realized that I didn't possess these loyalties, that I didn't have this depth of feeling. And so what through him I discovered, and I think it's true as I traveled in Pakistan as well, how much India had kind of, Iqbal's idea of utopia people always say it's a positive idea. Oh, a perfect place, a perfect... But utopia is much more about rejecting than it is. It's about undoing the world that exists. And people who make utopias don't often think about, whether it's Lenin or Iqbal, they don't think about what they're going to put in its place. And with the particular utopia I found in Pakistan, it was a place that I've described as a negative identity, where the rejection of India was paramount in Iqbal's mind. But what would he bring into being? And in Pakistan, I felt constantly on every level the failure of that identity. I felt that India swelled up in people in ways that they could hardly identify. But every time it did, it was something to be rejected. And that through that rejection, they were being Pakistani. And they hadn't, this is what Salman Rushdie calls like the insufficiently imagined country. And so, yeah.
So, when you say that, we had General Shah sitting earlier, and I think there is a sense amongst Pakistanis, the same way that we have perhaps in India and us who are Hindus now, that the right wing, those who are really at the extreme ends of political articulation of religion, are a minority within a much larger swath of people who have a different relationship with faith. And General Shah spoke of people like Salman Rushdie or Taslim or Irshad Manji, who critique Islam by rejecting it outright, or really constructing. Did you arrive at that?
Well,
you now call yourself a Muslim as well.
You have to remember that the first writer Rushdie ever met was my great uncle Faiz Ahmed Faiz. The first writer I met was Salman Rushdie, and there is a tradition within Islam, Mir ke dino mazhab ko ab poochte kya ho, unne to kash ka khencha der mein baitha, kab ka tark Islam kiya. There is atheism within the Islamic tradition that carried right down to us because we were like the children of poets. And so this feeling of like wanting to reject the faith was very much part of like a culture of irreverence that, for instance, Javed Akhtar is completely exposed to. So this is not this business about, yes, we were very proud to be irreverent about religion and things like that, and I'm very sad that culture is dying out now, because now even my Urdu teacher, Zafar Muradabadi, suddenly has the calloused forehead, he has the dadi, he has to say all these pieties. In the beginning, he was very proud of this poetical tradition in Islam that was irreverent. So that was the world that very much that my father grew out of.
So, Aatish, just to stay a little longer with your father before we move to the other areas of your life, that again, it was literally literary irony that brought you together with him on the night Benazir Bhutto was assassinated. And there again is a whole story, because he went back from his love with your mother, went back to Pakistan actually to fight General Zia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And then he ends up becoming a minister in General Musharraf's regime. So he fights one dictator, becomes a minister in another dictator. He really was a very close political co-traveler and friend of Benazir Bhutto.
Yeah.
Ends up being on the side of the establishment that there's a suspicion had a hand in the killing of her.
Yeah.
And you're together with him on that night. What insights did that yield? And when he was assassinated, what reconciliation did you finally come to about who your father was for you?
Well, the insight, Shoma, was simply this, and I had this is what one must remember when we enjoy, when we clap in Pakistan's misfortune. The insight was a great depth of pain and of sadness related to the idea and the failure of Pakistan. And you must remember that these are very familiar people, that there's the extension of Punjabi culture, of syncretic culture into this is really culturally India, so to speak. And an event happened not very long ago in the lives of nations. 70 years or whatever it is nothing. And people by the time Benazir died, especially, you were really brought to face to face with the utter failure of this project. And my book had been quite clever at the analysis and the thinking and the sort of and being critical of him. What it had missed was, I guess, the feeling of empathy. And that night, to see him really watch the kind of hero of firstly, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto obviously was the person who brought him into politics. This was the person he walked away, carried away in a little coffin, you know, so every time one sort of feels happy about the misfortune of Pakistan, one has to remind oneself of how painful its failure has been.
So, you know, just the tragedy of your father's assassination was that he was actually fighting the forces that, in a way, his father had helped engender. And I don't know how many of you in the audience know that when Salman Taseer was assassinated, it ended up being that his assassinator was celebrated on the streets. A street was named after him. The cleric who performed his final rites had to leave the country. The judge who put out a death sentence for the assassinator had to go off to Saudi Arabia. And the parliament refused to pass even a resolution against his father's assassination. And those are, again, reminders for where India can head if we don't watch ourselves.
And we were in this place last week. You know, we finally had Asia Bibi released. We had this sort of upward arc. And then Rizvi comes out into the streets and he's chanting the kalma. And he tweets, you know, these hamare mazakarat sab kuch fail ho gaye hain. Ye log hame bhoon denge. Rejecting the army, rejecting the judiciary, saying, you know, we'll tear it all apart. 5 minutes later, the army chief is on television saying, oh, why are we being dragged into this? And it results in a complete capitulation on the part of the Pakistani state. And really, it would have been a point where if that element comes forward and you don't respond with force, if you don't horsewhip them, because they're a very cowardly element. But if you encourage that, they'll overwhelm your public life, you know? And so that is the lesson for India.
So finally, you know, Aatish, before we move away, this question I just asked you, that this element, this strand of Islam, you know, where it's almost calcified in history and it refuses to renew itself, or where Pakistan positions itself only in opposition to India, or a negation of its subcontinental culture. Did you find that to be a minority thread? You know, because you've said in your book that many Pakistani friends of yours were upset with you because they said this is just a minority thread.
Yeah,
and they see themselves as really the...
What they don't say, though, is that they're not prepared to defend their Sufi culture. They're not prepared to defend syncretic Islam. When the Dariwala comes out and starts telling them what their religion is, they become cowed. And, you know, every one of those people go to Data Sahib, they do actually, my father was right, they do have a Sufistic religion, but when that religion is under threat, if you're not willing to say, Mr. Little Wahhabi man, you go back to Saudi Arabia, this is our religion, then you cannot say that it's a minority, because somewhere in your heart, you're in the throes of this other thing.
So we'll come back to this if we have time. Let's move then to your latest book. You know, I'm jumping many arcs, but let's come to the latest book because, so in the meantime, you know, you've lost your father, you've lost somewhat that half of you, which is the Muslim identity, and you're living out life in India. Something about you makes you feel restless even here, you know, and you move away to New York, you find out you're gay, you marry, you know, a white man. And then you say that just
Sounds
18...
so bizarre.
It sounds bizarre. Why? Why? I'm not even coming to the British royalty whose hearts you've broken. You know, but we'll come to that. But why I'm asking that is that you've said within 18 months of being in New York, you start missing India. You know, you feel that there's a kind of wisdom here that people just preserve. There's a kind of wisdom of humanity that you come back seeking through Sanskrit. Now, I'm really fascinated by that.
No. So this is the way that you said it's not quite right. The Sanskrit began for me almost 10 years ago, and it's fed my novel The Way Things Were. And it was part of what I felt that and this was a lesson from Pakistan, is that it's very dangerous to live in a cultural isolation from a place, and now obviously everyone is aware of that danger, because literally from India to the United States, people who have cocooned themselves need to be afraid. And what I felt was that there was something so strange about how we grew up in India, so strange that I had this passion for literature, and that literature, there'd been a continuous tradition of literature for 20 centuries in India, and none of those writers had come my way, you know? So the desire for Sanskrit was literally, I wanted to hear a voice from the past, people doing what I wanted to do in the same geographical area, and in a place with a less troubled history that would have been so natural. The British would have reached so naturally to Chaucer, to Beowulf, and the fact that we had been kind of undernourished in this way culturally was so damaging as a writer. It damaged your voice, it damaged your confidence. And so Sanskrit was a way for me to open up this massive body of literature, not religious texts, not shastras, not just literature. And so that's how that became an interest. And the thing that I had carried over from what had happened in Pakistan had been this idea of culture wars, and especially of the danger that an English-speaking elite put itself in if it didn't kind of actively do this business of decolonization. And this was all pre-Modi. So the book I went to write in Benares in 2014, March 2014, was a book that used the Brahmins of Benares as a prism to explore what I was beginning to see were our culture wars. And obviously the symbol of Benares was potent enough because Modi that week came and declared it as his constituency, and in a funny way he was repurposing its symbolism for this new politics of cultural revivalism, of right-wing populism, of revenge to some extent. And so that was the genesis of the book. And then I came back, in the meantime I had got married and moved away, and I came back to look again at these people that I was focusing on in a cooler time, in a time of reflection, and this was kind of the symmetry of the book.
So I'm going to come back to Varanasi and your discovery there, and also the kind of lessons you took away from it. But first, just to connect these two chapters of your life, what are put very boldly, what are the lessons from Pakistan that India needs to heed at the particular kind of, moment that we are in? There's a kind of precipitous time when we can really go a certain way. What do you think are the lessons from
Pakistan? The lessons are twofold. On the one side, it's to that very entitled English-speaking class who really wants to kind of put their foot on people's religion, on their cultural beliefs, on the things that they cherish, and say, listen, to be modern, you have to leave everything behind, and you come empty-handed into modernity. Like, if you mistake modernity for westernization and not for a deeper system of values, then you're doing a terrible disservice to your past, to your culture, to your religion. That's the lesson for the English-speaking classes. And in a place like Pakistan, thank you. For the people of Pakistan, because their system is so rigid and they don't have the possibility of democracy sort of containing a revolution, the system becomes so rigid it breaks. And people get killed, institutions get demolished, you're in big trouble. The lesson for the Chaddiwalas, for the RSS and that group or whatever, is that you have to understand that whether it is 7th century Arabia, or Ram Raj, that you must understand that the past, like that revivalism is a business of not acknowledging that the past has been lost, and of bringing back something that is not the past, but that is the past repurposed to suit the needs of the present. And what you come back with is something that's full of the violence of your experience. And it's not only will it destroy your culture and your religion and stuff, it can be terribly violent. And in Pakistan, that violence has broken its bounds. It can't really be contained anymore. In India, it could be, because it's possible to have renaissance, which is the positive side of rediscovering one's past. It's possible to take the germ of what one was and find it and realize that as much as the past is dead, that the future is open to you, But if you don't do that and you start to weaponize your religion, then you're in an equal danger.
So, I think one of the most positive messages to take from the rise of the Hindu right in India is this message of caution that you're saying, which is that the anglicized ruling elite in India had got very cut off from its cultural heritage. You spoke of this phrase which really stuck in my head, a kind of automatic incuriosity about our own literature, our own heritage, our own culture. Most of us, like you said, wouldn't have read of the Sanskrit literature texts, forget about the Shastras or the Upanishads or Vedanta or any of that.
And especially with Sanskrit, it's such a disservice because at every point, the Sanskrit writers make a very clear distinction. Veda is not Shastra, is not Itihas, is not Kavya. In fact, they use, it's a very nice thing, they use word and meaning. So the Veda is authorless. Word and meaning are sort of like, when you come to Itihas, word and meaning are exact. There's no gap. It's what meaning wants to express, the word perfectly encapsulates. When you come to Kavya, there's a gap between word and meaning, and that area of play is literature. So these are people who know these distinctions,
Beautiful. Yeah. So, you've spoken of yourself very evocatively as somebody who embodies what the subcontinent could have been if partition hadn't happened, because you can literally live the troika of Urdu, Sanskrit, and English, and you've lived that out, So again, coming back to Varanasi, you spoke of something very important, Aatish, if you could elaborate on that. You said that the Chinese have a very interesting way of dealing with its past. Yeah. They have an idea of everlastingness, which is not embodied in buildings, the Ayodhya temple or anywhere, that they understand that the past is not a physical structure, and they live with it. Now, India seems to have that genius.
We do have that.
And yet you came away from Varanasi with a sense of misgiving. You felt that it was on that tip of stepping into modernity when it could just stop being that living city and become any place, anywhere. Why do you think India is hurtling towards that,
Yeah, it's a very beautiful concept. It's this a wonderful Belgian sinologist called Simon Lees who writes about China, and he describes that the power of China's tradition to adapt has been because its everlastingness is too important to be enshrined in buildings. And there's a nice resonance with that in India, where in Kashi, after much destruction, Narayan Bhatta comes up with this idea of the Dharma of Place. And he says that it may be that a building is destroyed, but that its inner sanctity remains. And so Indians, especially in Banaras, they deal all the time with this idea of the intangible city, of the immaterial city. Anand Maharaj says, you may see this Kashi before you, but the Kashi that is the sun behind the clouds is a different Kashi. So there is, that is definitely been part of the genius of Indian tradition. And, the people in my book understand these things very well. And do you know they were never threatened as long as the Congress people were there? Because they said, these guys can go on and have their little Angrezi government, no threat to us. It's the Chaddiwalas. They thought for the first time, our tradition, which is much grander and more sophisticated than they understand, is now in their hands. And they're going to use it as they will, and use it for political purposes. And I don't know if this is unavoidable. Maybe it is unavoidable. Maybe the energy escaping the collapsing edifice of tradition is bound to feed a politics of populism, of revivalism. Maybe that's where that energy would naturally go. But there certainly was a feeling in this city of death of tradition itself being in a state where it was kind of like, I think at one point that the great genius of India was that they had managed to make the fact of death, which is one of the supreme facts of life, they'd managed to make that something that one was not afraid of. In the West, one is so afraid of death. In Banaras, one is not. But this great tradition had not accounted for another death that was occurring, which was the death of the tradition itself.
Aatish, you put it very beautifully that it takes a culture which can come up with the concept of shunya to act that the city, Banaras, actually embodies the idea of shunya,
I don't know if it does. It's a writer looking at it, but I've always found it so mesmerizing that you have the city on a river. Now in the West always you'll have the two sides, the left bank, the right bank, you have the river. But in Benares you have this space that is a consecrated, uninhabited land. The city gazes into a void, into a sandbank. And to me, it was enshrining this idea. You know, I thought only a culture that could have come up with the zero would have also conceived of their greatest city as staring into a void. But it's not, I've never read this. Yeah.
Yeah, so just one more anecdote before we move to some other themes in your life and your writing. Would you describe to the audience that particular encounter of these Sanskrit scholars, and just why was it so exciting for you to discover this very academic conversation going on? And again, what is that culture that we are all cut off from, sitting as we are with English educations? What is it that we are cut off from, which perhaps fuels the rise of the Hindu right? They're doing it all wrong.
Yeah.
They're articulating it wrong, but there's a seed of truth at the heart of it.
Well, there's a range of characters. There are older Brahmins, but the younger ones, what I found the most powerful moment when one travels is one leaves home with one's reasons for traveling. It's not always the case that one arrives in a place and that those reasons are recognized, that the people you travel amongst understand what's at stake. And with that moment with Shivam, for instance, came as an 8-year-old to Benares, and he came in this very traditional way, you know, as if, like, you know, it's the ritual among Brahmin boys when they're getting married, that they reenact. It's a charade where they say they're going off to Kashi with the Veda on their shoulder, and then the uncle stops them and says, don't be so silly, it's a very dangerous journey, you come back and get married. But he'd actually done that. He'd actually lived the life of the Vidyarthi. He'd lived the whole, he kind of, and at one point, we're standing at I think it was the Dashashwamedh Ghat, and I'm saying that, I'm asking about adhunikta and parampara, and he says, nahi, tanav hai adhyatmikta aur adhunikta ke beech mein. Like it's our spiritual civilization versus this material modernity. And it was a really powerful moment for me, because it was someone in the journey realigning one's way of looking, you know, and these guys were the real pathos of them having this, you know, to see people living in a small room that we might even just look, you know, in Delhi describe as hardly better than a servant's quarter, and the grandest texts of Indian literature, 20 centuries of literature lying there in little red cloths, and they're cooking for themselves. And it's very powerful. It's like a scene out of Chaucer or something, like medieval, like, and at the same time, they're full of despair because they know that this education is not going to get them anywhere. And they tell you all the time of that feeling of desperation, because they can't be romantic about it. This is their life. They have to be quite serious about their choices, and many of them will like be lucky if they end up as a sort of peon in a government office, or, you know, it's.
Sure. So, you know, we'll come to why you moved away and why you feel that after this passionate engagement with India, that somehow a distance from India is where your sanity lies, you know, where almost caring for India has become too much of a burden. So we'll come to that.
It was Naipaul.
Naipaul who said that.
He said that there came a time in my life when I stopped worrying about India, and it was a great freedom.
And you feel the same now. You feel the same. You feel the same.
I want to feel the same.
I want to feel the same. I want to feel the same. You have to say it in triplicates, right? But we'll come.
I don't think he ever did either, by the way.
What? That he ever stopped caring?
Yeah, I think you say that when you want to get there.
Convince yourself. Yeah. But we'll just come to that. But before that, I was asking you that, you know, if you could just elaborate on that point, because I think it was a very important point, where you said that tradition in India is under attack, not from the anglicized governments of the Congress, or not even from this anglicized community that we are a part of.
Yeah.
That tradition in India is under attack from the Chaddiwalas. You know, can you elaborate on that? Were there people in Varanasi who were enunciating that, and what is that?
Well, it was very interesting because two of the characters, Anand Mohan Jha and Shivam Tripathi, were both ABVP, and I with Shivam, I travel with him to his village and stay with him, and he becomes one of the main threads through this book. And what's extraordinary is that one lives with a sense of one's own rootlessness, and one can identify it easily. Oh, one is English speaking, this has happened, we are the Legis Macaulay's children, whatever you may call it. But the global world is such, and it's such a surprise, that on the other side, the most rooted kind of person, you think, what could be more traditional than this boy Shivam, is also living with a feeling of homelessness, of a world grown strange, of an unfamiliar, unrecognizable reality, and the loss of old ways. And he's channeling a lot of that restlessness, a lot of that sadness, a lot of that thing into a politics that he thinks will help him, will recreate a world that has been lost to him. And this idea of a mutual homelessness, that it's not just the coastal elites, it's not just people sitting, you know, in the big metropolitan cities, but people in heartlands who are living with this sense of loss, is a very, very important thing to recognize, because it could be a sort of stent to extend some kind of mutual compassion, of a feeling that if that kind of understanding could exist, then one could find some sort of better place.
So, you know, politics set you and your father apart to a certain extent. Tavleen was a big sort of supporter, admirer of Mr. Modi when he first came to power.
As was I.
As were you.
Yeah.
But now you've become very critical of Mr. Modi. You feel very disappointed by him. And why is that? Why has that change come into you? And secondly...
It's come everywhere. I just came back from Benares. 2 years ago, if you said something against the Prime Minister, you could almost put yourself in danger. Now, there's a quiet silence. Nobody says a bad word, but nobody stops you either. And the Prime Minister should be worried that it's come to that. And for me, I covered the 2014 election from Benares. I found it a very moving election. I reject the idea that it was an election of chauvinism and a menacing election. I think there were menacing elements, but I really felt like I saw journalists confront people and they would say, "Ji, mandir ke baare mein bataएं," and they said, "Hum vikas ki baat kar rahe hain aur aap mandir ke baare mein pooch rahe hain." They would correct them, and now here we are in this world of mandirs, and he unleashed a climate. I think he did it deliberately through a kind of through a passivity that was very calculated, and he let an atmosphere develop that is repugnant and that's very, very harmful. And so it's not with a sense of triumph that I say that I'm now against the Prime Minister. It's really with a feeling of tragedy.
Sure, it was a hope vote for many people,
Yeah.
and there is that sense of disappointment. The question I was asking you is that, has that created some degree of separateness between your mother and you know, a difference in politics?
I think she's disillusioned too quietly. I don't think perhaps she can say it. Businessmen are disillusioned. Businessmen, I mean, my stepfather was a kind of Hindu Mahasabha man. When they killed Gandhi, they arrested his father. It was that kind of Hindu background, and he can't bear what's happened. So I don't think that it's, I really don't know. I have to look and find the people who are still holding out, you know?
Well, just on a light note, you were sharing a joke from Varanasi about the Japanese. Well, maybe that's something to, on a light note, before we move away.
Oh, no. It's just that this climate of irreverence had developed, and in Indian politics, when they start making jokes, the politician has really to be worried. And in this case, there was, he had brought the Japanese Prime Minister, Abe, to build a second Kyoto in Varanasi, which the people of Benares certainly didn't like. And as he left, they said, "Abe Modi."
Well, 3 cheers to Indian humor, at least,
Yeah.
if nothing else. You know. But so let's just switch a little bit before we run out of time to one more aspect of your identity, which was, as we said, your sexual identity. You know, and 377 has, of course, just been written down. But you used a very interesting phrase. You said that you were really a sexual refugee until this happened, and you felt that. And it, in a way, was a point of tension with both your parents. Would you describe that? You know, both very liberal, coming from, again, sort of what one would imagine would be an intrinsically humanist liberal position on sexuality as well.
Yeah.
What explains that conservatism? What was the personal war you had to fight? And where do you feel now? And my codicil question to that is, you've been through so many levels of displacement, you know, political, geographic, cultural, parental. In all of that, today, where do you find yourself? You know, is finding love finally your sense of home, or do you find it somewhere else?
No, on the first point, I mean, obviously, it was, you know, liberalism of my mother's variety had come up to a certain point. You know, I always ask people, did your parents have gay friends? And my mother, of course, did. Like, she brought me up, but to her, it had gone to a point where, you know, her gay friends were very queenie, very effeminate. She saw them in a certain light, and she just didn't think like her only son was going to go down this dark road. And it was a kind of, you know, despite this, it took her a long time to come to terms with that. And at the same time, you know, when you have this business of, you have these different cultures in your mind at the same time, I was aware that a new world had come into being in Europe, in America, and that it was very hopeful that people were living really wonderful, full lives. It was not like the depressing world my mother kept bringing up of like the 60s, where you had these unhappy relationships, and the whole thing kind of like ran like a 300-pound train into like the AIDS catastrophe of the 80s. It was a very bleak picture that she had in mind. And I was like, I don't think that it's so bad. And I feel I was right. Like, I feel I was able to have my life elsewhere. And I didn't want to spend, you know, it's the person you live with, who you like work with, I mean, who you sort of wake up with, who you kind of wait for in the evening. Like, that stuff is very basic. You don't want to fight for that. You may want to fight for your religion and your country and the big abstractions, but your actual daily life, you just want that to happen, you know, and so for me, I didn't want to fight a crusade on behalf of that, so I left.
So we've run out of time. Just last, I don't know if there are questions. I'm going to quickly look for that. That there's just this mild strand of embarrassment when I've asked you each time about finding love or your relationship or.
No, I'm not embarrassed. I'm, you know, I have this wonderful, as I say, a tall white man from Tennessee, and we're very happy with it. It's very, like, I have to say, where I think you're right is that it's never been, you know, I've been absorbed with other questions, and this has been something for me that, like, it hasn't really, I'm not part of the political movement for gay rights, so I'm a little unfamiliar to that culture. And one thing that did come up in the trip, for instance, is that I still have the thing which Ryan makes fun of me for all the time, is that confronted with traditional India, or even like some older taxi driver in New York who's from Lahore or whatever, I completely be like, oh, this is my friend. And he's like, you know, how dare you? Like, they're willing to defend their bigotism, but you're not willing to defend, like, your relationship. But
the good lack conviction.
yeah, so I guess I don't have a political identity when it comes to that, but I'm certainly not embarrassed, no.
Okay. You know, we just heard the audience response to General Shah. They loved him, but they didn't have questions for him, which was strange. Yeah. And they don't have questions for you, though I can feel from the clapping that they are loving you, you know. So maybe there'll be a lot of questions afterwards. So I'm going to use that 1 minute extra to ask about the colorful end of your life, which was how you took down British royalty. You know? And took down is, of course, a euphemism. You dated this princess for 3 years.
She was not a princess.
Oh,
yeah.
she wasn't a princess. Here starts the takedown. And then you go and write a piece in Vanity Fair about how living with the royals felt, that you swam naked in Buckingham Palace, you did drugs in their palace, and that you flew EasyJet, which was economy. You know, you want to tell us about the downfall of the British through you?
Shoma, I write, as most of my family has discovered, I write about all that I consider my material. You know, I don't write necessarily out of like malice or whatever, but I want to write in different registers. I want to write like serious books about Benares. I want to write like a fun piece for Vanity Fair about dating a royal 15 years ago. It wasn't like, you know, an editor said like, don't you think it's time? Wouldn't you want to do it? And I was like, yeah, actually, and it sort of wrote itself. and I started making myself laugh as I was writing it, and I thought, okay.
So, for those who haven't read your Vanity Fair piece, of course,
Yeah.
you can go online and read it and chuckle yourselves. But you want to share some great insights about. But it also, again, to be fair, and I'm being facetious, but you do have a sociological insight about Britain through that.
Totally. It's it's almost what you're talking about is restricted almost to the first paragraph, and it was actually like they very much said, like, will you look at the royal family in the context of race, in the context of what's happened to Britain. And for me, it was fascinating because for the first time, you know, I had always, British confidence had been something that I took for granted. They were always so sensible. They never put a foot wrong. For 500 years, they won and won and won. And suddenly, a culture was like filled with illusions. Illusions, the kind of which, you know, you hear in the Islamic world when I would travel, they were talking about when we were great, you know? And suddenly the British were making a catastrophic decision based on this kind of thing. So I thought it was fascinating what was happening in Europe, that it was the first real sign of age and decay in a culture that had had 500 years of flowering.
Sure. So the most crushing thing he says about them is flying with royalty meant that you had to fly economy in EasyJet. You know, they haven't forgiven him that one. There's just one, which is a nice note to end on, which is love your name. Sorry, there isn't a name from the person who sent the question, but does it mean inner fire? Who gave you this name, and is there history attached to your name?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Taseer and Fez were friends, contemporaries, and Taseer at Cambridge. Taseer was the first person to get a PhD in literature from Oxford.
Talking about your grandfather.
Yeah, my grandfather.
No, he hasn't explained it yet.
I haven't got there yet. So Taseer met this English woman called Christabel, and then her sister came to India, was betrothed to someone, and that fell apart. And Fez married her, and she became Alice Fez, and Christabel was my grandmother. And my grandfather's main poetic work, his sort of compilation, was called Aatish Taseer, which means like fire temple. And when my parents got together, like, it was the one thing my father insisted. Aatish means fire, but it doesn't, in Urdu, it means fire in a literary sense. You can't really say my house is on Aatish, although in Turkish and Persian you can. You know, it's like ishq par zor nahi hai ye wo aatish. Like it's like that kind of aatish. But I remember my mother said, what if she's a girl? What if it's a girl? She's like, it's a total hooker's name. And my father's like, it's going to be Aatish.
Well, you've lived out every potential of Aatish. You've really been the fire. And thank you for excavating your life and giving us so much of cultural, political insight, both of sorrow and of triumph. And keep doing that, Aatish.
Thank you for having me, Shoma.
Thank you.
All right.